Susan Powell's disappearance in 2009 was the beginning of a tragic chain of events, culminating in the suicide of her husband, Josh, and his double murder of their 2 sons. In 2018, Susan Powell, Josh's father, died, taking many of the family's dark secrets with him to his grave. Now, a newly unearthed interview
I don't know the criminal mind works.
and a never-before-heard wiretap
You have a problem with reality.
reveals some of the twisted dynamics in the Powell family. We'll hear Stephen fighting with his own family members,
Get off my property.
his allegations of a secret love affair between Susan and a missing journalist, and, from his own lips, Stephen's admission of a dangerous obsession with his son's wife, Susan Powell.
It's out in the open now, okay?
Who should I look at as a person of interest? Who should I start talking to? Just as much as I've been talking to you, who should I talk to?
After Susan's disappearance, it didn't take long for Josh Powell to go from injured spouse to person of interest.
Do you consider yourself a suspect?
No.
Despite Josh's claims to the contrary, many had trouble believing his innocence, including his sister, Jennifer Graves. In the months leading to Susan's disappearance, Josh's sister, Jennifer, had grown close to Susan. They shared a mutual distrust of Josh's father, Susan Powell. Jennifer had been estranged from her dad for many years. When Josh moved in with his dad after Susan's disappearance, Jennifer became suspicious of the secretive bond between father and son.
Josh's sister comes to me and says, hey, what do you think about me wearing a wire and confronting Josh to see if I can get him to confess that he's responsible?
The West Valley, Utah Police Department flew Jennifer to Washington for a planned family gathering. The police put a wire on Jennifer and remained in a van just outside of Susan Powell's home. Jennifer waited for an opportunity to get Josh alone and confront him.
I was hopeful that Josh would actually slip up and say something, the truth, that he was responsible.
Why don't you put my mind at ease and tell me what happened? I'm your sister. Susan was my friend. She's your wife. For crying out loud, what happened?
I don't know what happened.
I'm just wondering, why suddenly did she disappear? And you didn't have anything to do with it? Really? Can you look me in the eye and tell me you really did not have anything to do with it?
I don't know what you're trying to say here, Jenny.
I'm confused.
That's not true.
Josh got upset and he exited the room.
In the midst of the confrontation, Susan Powell stepped in.
Pretty out there.
What's on
Yeah. Was it fun?
Excuse me? It's not obvious to me. You might imagine things, Jenny. You've always had a hard time with reality. That's a reality in your case.
I don't know what you're talking about. Hard time is my reality.
Yeah, you need to face reality.
Okay.
Yourself in your
I'll
own
face
way.
reality. Let's see. Josh went camping in '99, and Susan found. That doesn't sound like reality. Unless you did something.
Yeah. Anyway, I think it's time to go. It's time to go out and welcome. You are a is what you are. And to talk about your brother and my son that way, you have a problem with reality, and so anything you tell me is bull crap. Okay, Jenny? You guys aren't even welcome here anymore. You know, just get off my porch. Get off my porch.
Jennifer's attempt to get to the truth was thwarted by Susan Powell's need to control the narrative. Coming up, when Stephen sat down with U.S. Marshals to discuss the Susan Powell case, he continued to control the narrative, this time adding a very lurid allegation into the mix. In July of 2010, 6 months after Jennifer Graves confronted Josh and Susan Powell, Stephen spoke with U.S. Marshals about the Susan Powell case.
I mean, wouldn't you want to hear an alternative viewpoint to suggest that maybe she's alive?
One of the many things they discussed was Susan Powell's theory that Susan had run off with Utah-based journalist Stephen Koecher. This was a theory that Stephen and Josh had also posted to their susanpowell.org website. According to Susan Powell, Koecher and Susan had been having an affair.
So he was probably coming up to West Valley City as often as possible to visit her and spend some time with her and screw her.
The only reason anybody entertained this theory was the fact that, like Susan, Koecher disappeared in the early weeks of December 2009 under mysterious circumstances. Henderson, Nevada, December 13th, 2009, 1 week after Susan disappeared. This is a wealthy neighborhood in Henderson, a suburb of Las Vegas that's about a 2-hour drive from Stephen Koecher's home of St. George, Utah. This is the last known recording of Stephen Koecher, taken from a home security camera. We see Stephen's car drive through frame, and a few minutes later, we see Stephen walk up the street. To explain how we got here, we need to back up. Stephen Pacheco, a true crime podcaster, has studied the Stephen Koecher case extensively.
The case is fascinating for a number of reasons. You've got surveillance footage of him walking away from his car, parked in an area that no one has an explanation as to why he parked in that area. And just the days leading up to his disappearance in general are very out of the ordinary.
Wednesday, December 9th, 2009. Stephen Koecher has a brief phone conversation with his father.
He ends up leaving his house shortly after that phone conversation happens, and he drives 300 miles to Salt Lake City. He stops there, we know, because of receipts from gas.
Around 9:45 in the morning, Stephen makes another fuel stop in West Wendover, Nevada, 429 miles from his home.
Then he makes an unexplained stop at his ex-girlfriend's parents' home in Ruby Valley. Now he's 543 miles from home. He sits with them for a couple of hours, and then before he leaves, tells them that he's going to Sacramento to visit family, which, of course, we later find out he doesn't actually have family there. He calls his sister later that day. He doesn't mention to her that he's been driving all over the place. He ends up back home at 11:30 at night. He's driven a total of 1,100 miles. No idea where he was going, why he was doing it, and he never talked to anybody about it other than his ex-girlfriend's parents, to who he lied.
Is it possible that all this driving was somehow related to Stephen's new job for a window washing company?
There was a theory that he may have been going around handing out flyers for the window washing company that he was employed with at the time. I don't know why he would be going that far away to hand out flyers for his job. The next day, he goes to work. It's a normal day. It's as if he didn't just drive 1,100 miles.
On Saturday, Stephen hits the road again. Another seemingly aimless trip, this time totaling 400 miles.
And he comes back home, and then it brings us to the day that he disappeared, which was Sunday, December 13th. He receives a phone call at 7:50 in the morning, and it's a member of his church asking if he can come to the church. Well, Stephen tells him, I can't go, I'm in Las Vegas. And then the next time that Stephen shows up anywhere is at 12:54, which is when surveillance cameras show him walking away from his car. His phone pings about 14 miles away, and it stays active, and his voicemail gets checked before the phone ultimately goes dead. So somebody had access to his phone and checked his voicemail.
So what are the theories regarding Stephen Koecher's disappearance?
There's two possibilities that stand out most strongly in my mind. One theory was either he ended up in that area accidentally, or he was purposefully meeting someone in that area and he became the victim of foul play. If it was foul play, there's a lot of places in the desert that you can hide a body. The other most likely stems out of the possibility that Stephen may have experienced depression and made a terrible choice to end his own life. The only thing which makes me lean a little against that theory is most of the time when someone goes off with the intention of taking their own life, they're not going to go out of their way to conceal their body or to do it in such a way where they're unlikely to be found.
I think they got married. That's my conjecture.
There's nothing factual or legitimate or solid that I have ever seen that draws a connection between Stephen Koecher and Susan Powell other than they disappeared with close proximity to one another. The story about Stephen really was just designed, in my opinion, to completely divert attention away from Stephen Powell and Josh Powell and to put the blame on the victim in a lot of ways. They tried to make it look like everything bad that happened was because of a choice that Susan made.
The Stephen Koecher story is just another strange footnote to the Susan Powell case. Stephen's disappearance remains unsolved. Coming up, we'll look at perhaps the most bizarre aspect of the case, Susan Powell's obsession with Susan.
I appreciated that she was a beautiful woman.
If you have information about the whereabouts of Stephen Koecher, please contact the St. George Police Department at 435-627-4300. During Susan Powell's conversation with the U.S. Marshals, he covered many topics. The media.
They're hateful, they would like to lynch me and Josh both.
The poor parenting skills of the Coxes.
They have had problems with their daughters. Their oldest daughter, Mary, was divorced at age 21.
His own proficiency at parenting.
I'm a very nurturing parent.
And his relationship to Susan.
Is it true that Susan was in love with you?
Yeah.
It's important to note going forward that Susan Powell is an unreliable narrator. This conversation with the U.S. Marshals occurred years before details emerged about Powell's psychosexual behavior. And during Susan Powell's divorce hearing in 1992, it was well documented that he had abused his wife verbally and encouraged his own children to abuse her physically. Initially, Stephen characterizes his relationship with Susan as a lost young girl flirting with an older father figure.
Girls fall in love with their high school teachers, they fall in love with their, it's like an infatuation and that kind of thing. She loved Josh too. It's not like being in love with somebody else, maybe you're not in love with Josh.
Did she ever come on to you?
Oh yeah. Our relationship started with Susan.
Very soon, however, his characterization becomes odd.
I said to myself, I am her relief valve. Because Josh is really hard to get along with sometimes, whether we were doing things together or not. I really still felt like she could see me as a relief valve.
Before long, Susan Powell was lost in a reverie.
But she was always extremely happy around me, always. I mean, the pictures I've taken of her when she was around me, I know she knew I appreciated that she was, a beautiful woman.
Clearly, there was a dimension to Susan Powell's behavior that upset his son, Josh.
Really weird, it was bizarre, but he would sort of try to ignore it. You could tell that he knew something was going on, but he would be ignoring it.
Rather than acknowledging this and backing off, Susan Powell seemed to revel in it.
After I told her that I was in love with her, she told him, and all of a sudden it was like, all this stuff that we've been doing together now is it's out in the open now, okay? Of course, then she goes back to her parents and says, he was coming on to me and, he's a pedophile. Pedophile, I don't know what the cutoff age is, but it's not 20-year-olds,
In September 2011, Susan Powell was arrested on charges of voyeurism and child pornography. Police found thousands of images of numerous young girls and women, including Susan, that Stephen had surreptitiously taken. Susan Powell was released from prison in 2017 and died in 2018. His death meant that the last person who might have known anything about Susan's disappearance was gone. Unfortunately, to this day, Susan Powell's disappearance remains a mystery. If you have information about the whereabouts of Susan Powell, please contact the West Valley City Police Department at 801-840-4000.